Welcome to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us.
Well, I'm Dave Nelson, director of Baylor University Press, and I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon with three friends, personal friends, also friends of Baylor University Press, for a great conversation today. I'm joined by, I'll go from my far left all the way down, Jamie Davies, who is tutor in New Testament at Trinity College, Bristol. Philip Ziegler is professor of Christian dogmatics at the University of Aberdeen. And Beverly Gaventa is professor of New Testament Emerita at Princeton Theological Seminary. They are here today in Waco, Texas, because of an event that is taking place at Baylor University tomorrow and Tuesday of this week that is on the legacy of J. Lewis Martyn, a New Testament scholar and professor who left a significant impact on the field of New Testament studies and on Christian theology. This is the 100th anniversary of his birth, and a gathering will take place of just a wonderful list of conversation partners to talk about his theology and legacy. So they are here. I should also mention that all three of my guests today have books that are publishing imminently by Baylor University Press. Jamie's book, Theology on the Run, we actually just got the first copy yesterday, which was great fun to open up and present that to him. Phil's book, God's Adversary and Ours, will come out in the coming days. And Beverly's book, Readings in Romans, will be arriving here shortly also. We're hoping that perhaps they'll be here even while you all are here, but no promises, but we'll see how this goes. Thank you all for joining me today and coming for this event. Just maybe to get us started off, all three of you have referred to, you draw upon J. Lewis Martyn's work in your own writings. I wonder if maybe we can start, Jamie, with you and then just go down. Talk about the significance of Martyn's scholarship for your own work, how you discovered his work, and the significance of it for your own research.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, I'm a bit of an outlier in that I never actually met Lou, although I feel like I know him through so many other people, which is kind of nice. I first encountered his work at the University of St. Andrews during my doctorate. When we, one semester, we read the Galatians commentary in our New Testament seminar. And so we all went away and read it in preparation. And I remember reading it and being kind of captivated by a lot of the ideas, particularly some of the big theological ideas in that commentary. It's one of the anchor commentaries. And was very excited to go into the seminar where I rapidly learned that I wasn't supposed to agree with this commentary. So I got caught up as a first-year PhD student with trying to figure out what I was supposed to make of this. And so there were some lively discussions about it and its impact and its importance. And so I lived with it for a little while. And then I picked it up again about a year after that when I was really struggling with trying to figure out what on earth my thesis was going to be about. And I was at a bit of a crossroads, not quite sure what I was going to write on. And I went away for a weekend with the Galatians commentary, and I sat and had one of the only times I've ever been on a silent retreat. I sat there with Lou Martyn's commentary, tried to wrestle with it, try to understand it, and out of that weekend, the kind of shape of my dissertation was kind of born. So I kind of feel like I owe that commentary the kind of the outline of my dissertation, which initially was a critique of the kind of apocalyptic reading of Paul that Martyn gave. And since then, I've continued to read his work again and have shaped and changed some of my ideas and responded differently to them. So yeah, I kind of feel like he's been a bit of a companion one way or the other. I regret, though, that my dissertation came out pretty much a couple of weeks after he died. So I didn't get the chance to kind of see what he would have thought of it. Maybe a good thing. I don't know. But yeah, that was me.
So I met Lou through a mediator, which I think is a typical way in which that happened often. Christopher Morse, in my case. I was visiting Union Seminary to do some Bonhoeffer research in the archive there, and I was staying with Christopher, and we were talking about the paper that I was writing on the Pauline character of Bonhoeffer's thinking. And he said, "Oh, you need to meet Lou Martyn." And I said, "I don't know who that is." And a couple of days later, we were on a train to New Haven, and we sat in the coffee shop near the train station with Lou and with Dorothy for the afternoon and just talked, which was typical, as I later discovered of his generosity with his time and his interest in someone who he never had met before. He subsequently read the paper that I wrote, and I have a lovely, long kind of discursive email in which he was interacting with all the bits and pieces and offering me corrections and encouragements and whatnot. And yeah, that was the beginning of a rolling series of conversations about what it would look like to try to take this reading of Paul up into Christian systematic theological work. Protestant theology in particular, perhaps, is sort of exposed to changed readings of Paul, given its investments in Pauline source material for much of its fundamental orientation. And it seemed to me kind of crucially important that if the kinds of readings that Lou was pioneering and that others were pursuing around him were to carry the field exegetically, then the consequences of that for rethinking Christian doctrine were real. So I owe Lou, to come back to your question, a kind of major impetus in my own work, which is a way of asking that question. And it's pulled my theological work back into rolling conversation with New Testament exegesis in a way that I'm grateful for.
Yeah.
No.
Well, in a way, I'm the outlier on this because I knew Lou as early as my first year as an MDiv student. I was forced into taking courses in Bible that didn't interest me. I'd had them as an undergraduate and didn't like them much. And I thought, well, I'll just take this course on Romans and get it over with. And there he was. And Lou, there was something in a class with Lou where he was so deeply engaged with the primary text that, for me at least, I don't know about others, it was almost as if I had to figure out what was this? Why was this so important? For him, this was clearly a matter of life and death. And I was drawn into the text and then into conversation with him around the text, which is exactly what he would have wanted. I didn't stay at Union to do my PhD. I went to Duke. We remained close friends, and we remained in a conversation forever. He was mentor, a word he would have hated, conversation partner, and close friend from then until he died. And I was very much shaped by his understanding of the vocation of the theologian.
Yeah. So Martyn is best known as being one of the leading proponents of this is something that Jamie referred to as the apocalyptic reading of Paul. My hunch is that most of our listeners will know what that means in terms of a school of Pauline thought. But there may be some who don't, and especially here in this country, apocalyptic, because of how fundamentalism shaped culture, and culture shaped fundamentalism over the course of the last maybe 50 or 60 years. Apocalyptic signifies something that maybe Martyn himself wouldn't have thought. So I wonder if perhaps we could just sort of go down the road, starting with you, Beverly, to just talk briefly, maybe introducing the idea of the apocalyptic Paul or the apocalyptic reading of Paul.
Yeah, there are, of course, numerous variations on this. Apocalyptic, of course, the word means revelation, and it can be used of a whole genre of literature in which there is a seer who has received a revelation from God about the future. The Apocalypse of John, what we call the Book of Revelation, is a book like that. I don't think anyone claims that Paul is writing apocalyptic literature in that sense, although there certainly are references to revelation, particularly to mystery in Paul. But the perception is that Paul has something in common with those types of readings, which often presuppose that the world is in dire straits for whatever reason, and there is no out from the human side. There has to be an intervention from God's side. So to speak of Pauline apocalyptic, as I do, is to talk about the word I use is intrusion, God's intrusion to rescue the world from powers of sin and death and other forms of captivity that affect all of humankind.
Maybe just to expand on that, one of the things which comes through in Lou's reading is, and those who pursue a kind of apocalyptic reading of Paul, is the importance of the idea of what happens in Jesus Christ as an event that makes or remakes reality. So to speak of apocalypse in this context is to qualify the character of what goes on in the work of salvation, and it's to draw out the kind of world-changing scope and the world-changing nature of that saving work. That's been an important feature of the reading for me too. It draws attention to certain kinds of motifs which prove kind of important. This notion that God comes to the world for the sake of the world against opposition, for example. There's a kind of range of opponents who are resistant to the purposes and outworking of the gospel. That redemption, Beverly spoke about captivity as the kind of problem to which the gospel is the solution. That suggests that some notion of redemption or liberation, release, rescue is the kind of the primary grammar of salvation in this way of reading Paul, as opposed to other things, reconciliation, forgiveness, and so on. It sort of emphasizes, it shifts the sorts of emphases, the conceptual emphases,
Right.
In ways which I think prove important.
Yeah, it's hard to add to those excellent intros to the question. Martyn spoke a lot in his commentary on Galatians about apocalyptic expressions, turns of phrase that Paul uses in that letter, things like the present evil age, things like new creation, this kind of language, signaling something that was vital to Paul's way of understanding the gospel and the gospel's impact on the world. The word apocalyptic, as Beverly said, literally means revelatory. It's often used, especially in popular discourse, to speak of the cataclysmic end of the world, and that's not without connection to what the word means in Jewish writings and Christian writings of the first century and earlier. But primarily, it's not really about the end of the world. It's far more about the revelation of what the world is really like. So there's a tradition there that Paul is both connected to and also radically different from in using these apocalyptic expressions, because for Paul, it's the event of the sending of Christ that is the decisive apocalyptic moment. And it's that action of God, not just to reveal another thing on the list of things the seers have seen, but actually God's self-revelation, which is his action in the world to deliver it from the powers, which is this decisive work of God, not merely the unveiling of something behind a curtain, but the actual, as Beverly said, the intrusion, or the language that Martyn used was invasion. But words trying to capture the dynamic activity of God of coming into a world held captive by anti-God powers to liberate it. So it's far more than the revelation of secrets, although it connects to that. When that which is revealed is God's self, you're dealing with much more than just a list of things revealed. You've now got the actual action of God in freeing a world held captive. That, for me, is one of the things that got me most excited about it, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about an apocalyptic reading of Paul. It's speaking about the sheer power of that liberative gospel.
Right. Very helpful. It's interesting thinking about the next few days that we'll have together, and the event that we're all participating in, and the conversation that will take place here. There are theologians, systematic theologians, as we're sometimes called, and New Testament scholars who are interested in and engaged in theological discourse, and theologians who are interested in taking seriously what Scripture says. What is it? I just find it fascinating. We're part of an academic guild where these two sort of wings of Christian theological discourse, the biblical studies and systematic theology, they tend to run in separate directions, kind of form in separate circles, right? But Martyn is one of those figures who it's not just he has found purchase in these two, but he's inspired theologians, he's inspired biblical scholars to take certain things seriously. So what is it, do you think, about his research, his legacy, that does that inspiring?
I guess we'll be talking about this, at length for the next couple of days. So it'll be interesting to build up the catalog of answers to that from across the piece. But I think for me, one of the things which is striking about his work is how it sort of moves in two phases. There's a sustained effort to really, really listen to the voice of Paul, the concerns of Paul in their original context. He's devoted to this idea that, one of our first responsibilities is the kind of strained effort to try to hear the letters in the way that they might have been heard by their original hearers.
Right.
And that's a good old-fashioned piece of New Testament discipline, that kind of scholarship, which theologians could do well to heed, no doubt.
Well, you mean theologians, sometimes they just skip over all of
I
that stuff?
couldn't possibly say, but yeah, one may infer, yeah. But the other thing that's inspiring too about Martyn's work is that, having done that listening, he envisages us to be participants in the long conversation that may have started in Galatia or Corinth or Rome, which in a way, has kind of found its way down to us, and invites us to sort of engage with the contests about the nature of the gospel and the truths and the realities which are at stake in it. We find ourselves kind of drawn into that earliest conversation now as kind of lately summit participants. And there's a kind of real present pressure that kind of reading puts on contemporary theological thinking, which I really appreciate the stimulus of that.
Yeah.
That there's a kind of invitation to enter into a fraught conversation, which has been going on for a long time before you ever kind of sat down in the classroom. But catching up on what's happening is your first obligation. But then once you caught up on it, you're genuinely a student in the same room as this original discussion was going on, and we're all sort of party to exactly the same kind of rolling debate about the truth and the meaning of the gospel. Yeah, so inspirational is a good word for it. It's a reading that really drives, I think, theological thinking. At least that's been my experience of it. Yeah.
In a certain way, the answer to your question about Lou and theology and biblical studies is generational. And part of it, interestingly enough, is he came out of a generation, his own generation did, in a sense, react against what they took to be, particularly with the Gospel of John, a kind of just abstract theologizing, right? And reading John as simply Greek philosophy or dipped into Jesus a little bit, and his own arguments, and Ray Brown's especially, and Wayne Meeks, took the historical setting seriously, but didn't isolate the historical from the theological. And his teachers were the same. People always think of him in connection with Ernst Käsemann, but he was also profoundly influenced by Paul Meinier and by Paul Meyer, all of whom were his teachers. So this bifurcation that we have experienced as guilds was to him simply anathema, I think, from the beginning. Yeah. And he didn't have much use for theologians who didn't care about the Bible. But what he did, and Phil's already alluded to this so beautifully, is he really loved conversation partners. And he took conversation very seriously. And he would listen to you or anyone else as carefully as he was listening to Paul or to Paul's conversation partners. So there was that deeply personal element of this.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that always struck me about Martyn's work was his concern for the real theological content of Paul's witness. What clever people tend to use German for, and to talk about the Sache, the actual stuff. Right. And twinned with this conviction that although he would do all the historical and textual and intertextual work and all the background stuff, a conviction that he wasn't in the business of describing a world other than our own, that Paul didn't live in this other world that we can stand away from and describe. That good old-fashioned biblical stuff that you talk about is actually a very modern invention, and isn't always how it's been done. That there's a conviction in Martyn that the world that Paul is talking about is the world in which we live. And so these, particularly his apocalyptic account of God's intrusion into that world, is also has purchase on us and lays claims upon us in ways that we take seriously, and that he takes seriously in his work. And so for me, it's kind of interesting that we find ourselves in dialogue with kind of more ethically engaged theologians, particularly as well, because they're also in the business of saying, what claims does this make upon the way that we live? And so I quite enjoy the way he transgresses the supposed boundaries of our guild. For me, that's one of the exciting things about this conversation that I've been part of for a few years now, is there's a place for specialisms, but there's also a vital need to at times transgress those set boundaries, and at the very least listen across them, if not actually attempt to speak across them as well. And so, yeah, I like it when Phil comes into my New Testament world and I go into his systematics world, and we try and learn from each other. And I think that's part of what Martyn maybe has set running amongst us, which is, I think, all to the good.
Yeah, I'll ask a few questions just to each one of you, talking about the importance of what Martyn's scholarship has meant for certain things that you're doing. And maybe, Phil, to start with you, I wonder if you kind of spoke to this earlier in the last question, but just maybe draw out a little bit more this idea that the conversation into which we are invited is not a settled conversation. It's an ongoing conversation. One almost would feel like the language of event and intrusion and apocalypse and systematic, there's a kind of a built-in tension between those ideas. You talk about that a little bit. I know that's been an ongoing interest of yours, is to think about how systematic theology can make the most of this very biblical way of understanding God's agency in the world.
Yeah, thanks. So, there's a kind of obvious initial intuition of a tension between the pursuit of the goals of systematic theological thinking, if by those goals you mean something like comprehensiveness, kind of ubiquitous, balanced coverage of all the sort of topics in Christian theology, a kind of clear, settled organization of themes and so on. And the language of systematic often keeps company with a sort of sense of the static, the sort of achieved, right? The delivered, everything's kind of packaged. And the idiom of Pauline apocalyptic, as we've sort of been discussing it here, does seem to push against those sorts of notions, right? The dynamism, the event fullness of the gospel, the dramatic character of things, and you might think that these two things are in a kind of pitched battle with one another, two different kinds of discourse. My sense of it is that there is something usefully unsettling about a fresh encounter with Paul's apocalyptic discourse that's very salutary for systematic thinking, not least because it's a provocation to think about that settled character and just how settled it is and how settled it should or can be allowed to become. I think, though, it's also a question of trying to find ways, theological, doctrinal ways of trying to give conceptual expression to exactly the dynamism, the eventfulness, the drama of the gospel in Paul's telling, and that means sort of experimenting with different kinds of forms, different kinds of the rebalancing of doctrines. What would it look like to take, say, the grammar of intrusion seriously, to think about divine action as having the quality of a kind of disruptive intrusiveness? How might that shape the way we think about the work of salvation, the notion of vocation we have, our thinking about church, the quality of our preaching? You can imagine. So, to me, it's a kind of very valuable provocation, and it's just the kind of exposure that a Christian theology that wants and needs to keep company and try to do justice to the Bible really needs to be exposed to. So for me, it's a sort of permanent discipline to stay exposed to the kinds of patterns, rhythms, and things which this way of reading Paul offers us.
Interesting. Jamie, your book that is just now coming out with us, the subtitle includes the phrase apocalyptic pastoral theology, which seems also, again, kind of, there's this built-in tension between these terms here. But perhaps you could talk about for just a little bit the practical pastoral aspects of this kind of way of recovering apocalyptic for theology and exegesis.
Yeah, I hope that subtitle doesn't have people running not to buy the book, because apocalyptic pastoral theology isn't the sort of thing people are desperate for. But hopefully
we'll see.
Hopefully I explain what I mean by that in the book. I hope I do. My original title for the book, as you know, was going to be Paul and the Real World, with scare quotes around real world. We eventually let that go, but that kind of, I still kind of think of it as that in my head. That question came from a couple of places. One was from Lou Martyn, who used to ask the question, what world is it? As a key kind of apocalyptic question. What world do we actually live in?
Yeah.
I spoke a little bit about that a second ago. The other place that came from is my students. I teach in a small seminary training students for Anglican ministry, and I would teach them some Pauline theology, and invariably somebody would say, what good is this for the real world? that drive in all pastoral ministry to, what can I do with this? What's the practical use of this? And I, being the kind of person I am, would tend to ask them, what do you think the real world is? Which is a question that I picked up from Lou Martyn. Dietrich Bonhoeffer used to ask a similar question in his Ethics, and his essay, Christ, Reality, and the Good, was one of the ones that got me off and running on this book. So to really interrogate that question and say, if we're truly going to have a Christian pastoral theology that's not just pastoral care with some Jesus dipped on it, right? The sprinkling of Jesus on top of, the standard approaches to counseling or to grief or whatever. If we're genuinely going to interrogate the logic of the power of the gospel to the very depths of what this means for pastoral care, then we must ask the question, well, what is the real world according to the gospel? And how does our practice of pastoral care, our practice of ministry relate to those claims that the gospel makes on what the real world is? And I think Paul's Thessalonian letters, well known for having chunks of ethical instruction on work, on sex, on proclamation of the gospel, on grief, all sorts of other things, and then rapid switches over to speaking about the imminent coming of Christ, there seems to be a disconnect. And yet the claim I make in the book is that those things are closely related, and the things that Paul thinks about the fundamentally apocalyptic nature of the gospel have bearings upon his pastoral interventions in Thessalonica. So it's an attempt to try and hold those things together and explain how there's actually these deep pastoral and practical and ethical claims being made. And as if that wasn't enough, I try and suggest some of the ways that might make sense for us today, following on that claim that I think Martyn pointed towards, that this still applies to the world in which we live, but without riding roughshod over the difference in history between us and Paul, and between my location and Thessalonica. But nevertheless, this is the same world, theologically speaking. So I still have to engage in some of the ways that we might practice pastoral care in the light of the fuller claims of the gospel, and not just working all that out and then doing some kind of cheap application of the gospel to a situation. It was an interesting challenge and involved me learning a lot of things in disciplines that I wasn't trained in. But that's part of the fun and the adventure of writing a book sometimes. So there we go.
Well, Beverly, I've heard that you've spent some time with Romans over the last. There's a rumor to that, right? No, with your recent commentary, and also the book that is just now publishing with the press, you have deeply read Paul's letter to the Romans, and I'm wondering, how has Martyn been with you on that journey as well?
That's a great question. Despite the fact that I started my journey in New Testament studies with Paul's letter to the Romans, I really did not write. I did not do research and write on Romans, apart from some attention to Romans 7 in my dissertation and one passage in Romans 8. But I had spent a long time working in other things. I'd done a lot of work in Galatians. And so when I started work toward the commentary, I came from that work on Galatians and from being influenced very deeply by Lou's work on Galatians. And I came with questions. I didn't come thinking, okay, here's Paul and apocalyptic, and I will ram this down the throat of Romans, whether it belongs or not. And many people make a lot of the differences between Galatians and Romans. Even Lou did. Yeah. My sense, after living with this thing for a very long time, is that Romans is different from Galatians in the way it says things, but it's not necessarily less radical. And, what the payoff is, there are many things we could mention, but I think maybe the one that is most timely is Paul's understanding of power. If you start looking at the way power is manifested in Romans, it becomes a terribly important dynamic in that letter. God's power is being revealed. God's power is at work. Well, that's for us a word that has a lot of connotations, not all of which are positive. But there is in apocalyptic this notion of revealing power, liberating power, invasive power, first of all. But it's also power for Paul in weakness. It's the weakness of the cross, which is not the act of the strong man, right? It's the power from underneath that lifts up people and redeems people, not power to oppress. So that's one of the things I would say. And the other, if I could have a second one, that has become really important to my reading of Romans is this element of doxology. which I think is not at all disconnected from apocalyptic. Doxology is what the creature does rightly. And in a sense, what's gone wrong with the world starts by the withholding of praise from God. So doxology, a sort of cosmic doxology, is a sign, not a negligible sign, of God's redemption.
Right. Well, we've got 2 days ahead of us of conversation. What are your hopes? What are you looking forward to over the course of the next couple of days?
Well, as one of the people who's helped to organize this, I'm just looking forward to having such a diverse group of people together. We have people here who knew Lou as I did for most of their careers, most of my adult life. We will actually have some members of his family present along with us, but we'll have people who knew him, people who didn't, people whose work is very much aligned with his and takes his agenda forward, and those who have some significant questions. And I think that the point of this is exactly the kind of lively, productive conversation he most enjoyed. Although I do have to admit, I'm not at all sure he would have let us throw this party had he been asked. But unfortunately, he wasn't here.
One of the things that's exciting about it for me is the chance, not just for a stock taking, but also for a sort of imagining the agenda that's arising from the stock taking. Right. That one of the things that I think I'm hopeful for is that from the kinds of conversations that we'll enjoy, we'll get a sort of emergent sense of a number of questions, tasks, open horizons, things that need doing, which we could take up as a fruit of the meeting and take forward in our own work. So yeah, I'm hoping that the sort of inspiration you spoke about earlier on, the sort of impulses, I think we'll gather those up in a particularly intense sort of way at these next couple of days. So
I'm just here for the barbecue.
All right.
But given that I've already had some, I think I probably should hang around for the conference as well. The word conversation has been mentioned a lot of times. And one of the things I'm looking forward to is to seeing how that sense of being in a shared endeavor, it being fun, it being a pleasure to do this. This is not hard work. This is good fun. To do it with people who have established friendship, and that this is a shared endeavor between friends, even friends who disagree, especially friends who disagree. So I'm looking forward to that, to meeting new people and to extending the conversation. I'm also looking forward to figuring out how we might continue to extend that conversation. Who's missing? Who have we not got with us? Who might Lou have introduced us to? Phil spoke about how he was introduced, and we've got to, I think, introducing people to each other and say, hey, you'll like the work they're doing. It's something you've not thought of, but I can see connections, and maybe you should talk to each other. That's why we get together and we don't just do all this via email. It's a chance to actually spend some time together. And Beverly's designed a conference with a team that gives us space for those conversations. And I think that's deliberate and important. I'm looking forward to those. So yeah, it's going to be fun.
Well, thank you all for this conversation and sharing some time here this afternoon before the event. Indeed, this is a Lou Martyn inspired podcast recording where we can gather together and just talk a bit about that inspiration of taking these kinds of conversations seriously. So thank you all for being here, and enjoy the next few days.
Thanks.
It'll be fun.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Et Al, a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.